Evelyn had never known about the lighthouse. It came as a shock, a note tucked inside a formal letter from a lawyer's office. She had been working late, going over spreadsheets in her cramped apartment when she noticed the thick envelope. It bore the name of a law firm she'd never heard of, and inside, with strange, almost cryptic wording, she learned that she was the sole inheritor of her great-uncle's estate. An estate that consisted solely of an ancient, decrepit lighthouse. The next weekend, with a mix of curiosity and unease, Evelyn made the long drive up the coast. She hadn't even known she had a great-uncle, much less one who had owned a lighthouse. The journey took her far away from the busy streets of a city, to a place where time seemed to have stalled. Cliffs rose up before her, and the ocean smashed angrily against them, sending mist into the air. The sound of crashing waves filled the air with a constant roar, as though the sea itself were alive with resentment. And then she saw it. The lighthouse stood there at the top of the cliffs, its tall structure darkened by years of neglect. It seemed to loom over the landscape like a silent sentinel, watching, waiting. As Evelyn parked her car and approached the structure, a strange chill crept up her spine. She wasn't sure if it was the cold sea air or something more intangible, something that clung to the lighthouse like a memory forgotten but not erased. The door creaked open with a groan, and the smell of damp wood and salt assaulted her senses. The interior was dim, even though it was the middle of the afternoon. Dust coated the floorboards, and every step she took sent up little clouds. The spiral staircase in the center twisted upward, disappearing into the gloom above. Despite its age and condition, there was something captivating about the place. The view from the cliffside was breathtaking, and the structure, though crumbling, still had an air of power. But that wasn't what unsettled her. It was the sense of presence, as though the lighthouse itself was aware of her arrival. Evelyn had planned to spend only a few hours there to assess the state of the building, but something made her stay longer. She explored each room, each crumbling corner, noticing strange things, like the mirrors hung in odd places, reflecting angles where they shouldn't, and the inexplicable feeling of being watched. More than once, she glanced over her shoulder, convinced that someone or something was following her. By late afternoon, the skies had darkened and a storm was rolling in. Evelyn decided to leave before it hit, but as she reached for the door, it slammed shut in front of her with a violent crash, as if pushed by an unseen hand. The sudden noise echoed through the empty halls, reverberating through her bones. She tried to pull the door open, but it wouldn't budge. The wind outside picked up, howling through the cracks in the stone walls, and the rain began to lash against the windows. Trapped inside the lighthouse, Evelyn tried to stay calm. She moved towards the spiral staircase, thinking she might wait out the storm in the upper room where she could see the coast. But as she ascended, the feeling of unease grew stronger. Every creak of the floorboards beneath her feet seemed amplified, every gust of wind more menacing. When she reached the top, the view was obscured by the storm. Lightning illuminated the churning sea below, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. But it wasn't the storm that made her breath catch in her throat. It was the figure. For a split second, she saw it, standing by the far wall, draped in shadow. Tall, with hollow eyes that seemed to glow in the lightning's flash. The figure was staring directly at her, unmoving, yet filled with a malevolent energy that made her blood run cold. Evelyn blinked, and it was gone. She backed away from the window, her heart hammering in her chest. Her hands were trembling as she fumbled for her phone, but the signal had died. There was no escape, no way to reach the outside world. And the storm, as if sensing her fear, raged on with increasing ferocity. The wind shrieked through the cracks like 1,000 voices whispering in unison. And as Evelyn huddled in the darkened room, she could feel it, that oppressive, suffocating presence growing stronger. The lighthouse had been waiting for her, and now she wasn't alone. The storm intensified, shaking the lighthouse to its core. The wind screamed through the cracks and gaps in the stone, and the rain battered the windows with such force that Evelyn feared the glass might shatter. She stood frozen at the top of the spiral staircase, her mind racing. What had she seen? That figure, Those hollow eyes. Was it her imagination? The shadows from the storm playing tricks on her? No, it had felt too real. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her pulse hammering in her ears. She could still feel the sensation of being watched, a heavy, suffocating presence lurking just beyond her vision. Desperate to escape it, she rushed down the stairs, her footsteps echoing through the narrow space. She reached the ground floor, but the front door was still sealed shut. No amount of pulling or pushing made a difference. It was as if the storm had locked her inside. The interior of the lighthouse felt like a cage. The circular walls seemed to press in on her, and the oppressive darkness felt thick, tangible. Evelyn fumbled for a light, but the power had gone out, leaving her with only the brief flashes of lightning to see by. Her flashlight was in her car, far out of reach. Forcing herself to stay calm, she decided to explore the lower floors, hoping to find some other exit or at least a way to feel safe. As she passed through the narrow hallway, her fingers brushing the damp walls, she noticed something strange, an old wooden door that she hadn't seen before. It was slightly ajar, barely noticeable in the gloom. A chill ran through her as she approached it. The air seemed colder near the door, and the faintest whisper of sound echoed from the other side, like the rustling of fabric or a breath drawn too sharply. Her heart pounded in her chest, but something compelled her to push it open. The door led to a narrow, winding staircase that descended into the depths of the lighthouse. The steps were worn with age, the stone crumbling beneath her feet. A foul, musty smell drifted up from below, thick and cloying. She hesitated, her instinct screaming to turn back, but curiosity, and perhaps something more, pushed her onward. The descent felt endless. The deeper she went, the colder it grew, and the whispers, barely audible before, became louder. She could almost make out words now, though they were distorted, as if spoken underwater. The air felt dense, oppressive, and with each step, she felt the weight of the place bearing down on her, as though the lighthouse itself was trying to crush her spirit. At the bottom, the staircase opened into a small, circular room. It was unlike anything else in the lighthouse. This room felt older, more ancient than the structure above. The walls were carved with strange, undecipherable symbols, and at the center of the room was a stone pedestal, cracked and worn with time. But it wasn't the room that drew her attention. It was the figure standing at the far wall. This time, she saw it clearly. The figure was taller than any person should be, its form gaunt and twisted, cloaked in shadows that seemed to writhe and pulse in the dim light. Its face, if it could be called a face, was a hollow, eyeless mask of bone, slick with seawater. Its mouth hung open in a silent scream, and in the flickering light of a nearby lantern, she could see the faintest outline of hands, long and skeletal, stretching out toward her. Evelyn gasped, stumbling backward, but the figure didn't move. It simply stood there, staring without eyes, its presence a suffocating force that pressed down on her like the weight of 1,000 waves. She wanted to run, to scream, but her body wouldn't respond. Fear had paralyzed her. As she watched in terror, the figure began to dissolve, its form flickering like a candle flame in the wind. The shadows it had cast receded, blending into the darkness of the room. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. Evelyn was left alone, her breath ragged and her hands trembling. But the room was no longer empty. On the stone pedestal, a single object now rested, a tattered, waterlogged journal. It hadn't been there before. She was certain of it. With shaking hands, she picked it up. The pages were damp and brittle, the ink smudged and faded. Yet, she could still make out the handwriting scrawled in jagged, uneven letters. The name inside the cover sent a fresh wave of cold terror through her. Jonathan Pierce, her great-uncle. Evelyn flipped through the pages, each one detailing the final days of Jonathan Pierce's life. His words grew more frantic with each entry, speaking of strange occurrences in the lighthouse, of doors slamming shut, of voices whispering in the night, of a figure he could only see during the storms, a vengeful spirit, bound to the lighthouse by some ancient curse, and doomed to return with each storm, growing stronger with every tempest that battered the coast. The final entry was written in a shaking hand. Asterisk, it comes with the storms. It watches. And now it knows I am here. Asterisk. The journal slipped from her fingers as another gust of wind slammed into the lighthouse, rattling the walls. From above, she heard the creak of floorboards, slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the top of the spiral staircase. She wasn't alone. Something was coming for her, and the storm was only growing stronger. Evelyn stood frozen, her back pressed against the cold stone wall of the underground chamber. The journal lay at her feet, its final words ringing in her mind like a warning. Asterisk, it comes with the storms. It watches. And now, it knows I am here. Asterisk. Above her, the footsteps continued, slow, deliberate, and far too heavy to belong to any living person. Each creak of the floorboard sent a fresh wave of terror surging through her. The air felt thick and oppressive, and she could feel the weight of unseen eyes upon her, watching her every move. She had to leave. Now. But there was only one way out. The winding staircase she had descended moments earlier. A staircase that led directly toward whatever was coming down from above. Her breath caught in her throat as she took a hesitant step forward, her fingers brushing the wall to steady herself. The footsteps had stopped. The silence that followed was worse, unnatural, thick with anticipation. She could feel it lurking just beyond her vision, waiting for her to make the first move. Summoning every ounce of courage she had, Evelyn crept toward the staircase. Her footsteps were soft, but in the stillness of the chamber, each one sounded deafening. Her heart pounded in her chest, and every hair on her body stood on end. She felt as though she were being hunted, and the walls of the lighthouse had become a trap, a place designed to ensnare her in the same nightmare that had claimed her great uncle. As she reached the bottom of the staircase, the wind outside howled, rattling the windows and sending a low, mournful whistle through the cracks in the stone. The storm was getting worse, the rain now coming in sheets, drumming against the lighthouse like ghostly fingers tapping at the glass. She began to ascend, slowly at first, her eyes scanning the shadowy space above for any sign of movement. But the higher she climbed, the stronger the feeling of dread became. The air grew colder, and the whispers that had haunted her before returned, soft at first, like the wind, but growing louder with every step. This time she could make out the words. He tried to leave, but it wouldn't let him. The voice was faint, echoing around her, but it was unmistakably human. Or at least it had been once. Evelyn's pulse quickened as she reached the upper floor. The room was dim, the flicker of lightning casting jagged shadows across the walls. But it was empty. The figure, the thing she had seen before, was gone. Only the eerie quiet remained. She let out a shaky breath, but her relief was short-lived. From the corner of her eye, she caught a flicker of movement, something shifting in the darkness near the windows. She turned, her breath catching in her throat, and there, half hidden by the storm's fury, was the figure once more. Only now it was closer, much closer. It stood mere feet from her, its tall, gaunt frame draped in shadows. Its eyeless face seemed to shift in the dim light, the hollow sockets where eyes should have been glowing faintly with a sickly, bluish hue. Its mouth hung open, unmoving, but the whispers she had heard before now filled the air around her, growing louder, more insistent. He tried to leave, but it wouldn't let him. The figure tilted its head, as though studying her. And then, slowly, it began to move, its long, skeletal hands stretching toward her, fingers curling like claws. Evelyn stumbled backward, her heart hammering in her chest. She needed to run, but the room felt like it was closing in on her, the very walls conspiring to keep her trapped. She turned and bolted down the spiral staircase, her feet barely touching the steps as she descended, but the whispers followed her, growing louder with every second. It won't let you leave either. She burst through the door at the base of the staircase, her eyes darting frantically for an escape. The front door, still sealed shut. The windows, bolted and covered in grime. Every exit seemed barred, every possible way out sealed by the storm that now felt less like nature and more like a force intent on trapping her here. Her pulse raced as she ran through the darkened halls, her hands scraping against the walls as she searched for something, anything that could get her out of this nightmare. But as she passed by one of the mirrors hanging crookedly on the wall, she froze. In the reflection, she saw herself, pale and shaking, her wide eyes filled with terror. But behind her, just over her shoulder, was the figure. Its hollow face was inches from her own, its skeletal hand reaching for her neck. Evelyn screamed, whipping around, but the figure wasn't there. The room was empty, yet the mirror, its surface now fogged with condensation from the storm, showed a message scrawled in jagged, dripping letters. "You can't leave." Her breath came in shallow, panicked gasps as she backed away from the mirror, her mind racing. The figure, the journal, the whispers, it was all connected, all tied to this place. And now, the lighthouse had claimed her. The storm outside raged with renewed fury, the wind howling like a wild animal. And in the distance, the faint sound of crashing waves grew louder. But there was something beneath the sound of the storm, something deeper, more malevolent. A voice, low and guttural, whispered from the depths of the lighthouse itself. "You are mine." Evelyn's back hit the wall, and in that moment, she realized with horrifying clarity, there was no escape. The lighthouse had trapped her, just as it had trapped her great uncle. And now, the vengeful spirit that haunted its halls was coming for her. The storm was merely a herald. The real terror was yet to come. Evelyn's breath came in ragged gasps as she pressed herself against the cold stone wall, her mind racing in search of a way out. The storm outside roared like a beast, rattling the windows with relentless fury, but it was nothing compared to the terror building inside the lighthouse. The whispers had grown into a cacophony of voices, each one more desperate, more malicious than the last. "You are mine." The words echoed in her head, twisting like a dark vine around her thoughts. She knew she couldn't stay still. If she did, the spirit, the thing would find her. But where could she go? Every exit seemed blocked, the front door sealed shut, the windows too narrow and bolted. And the figure, it appeared and vanished at will, like a predator toying with its prey. There was no escaping it, no hiding from it. But maybe there was something she hadn't yet discovered. The journal had hinted at an ancient curse, a force that bound the spirit to the lighthouse during storms. Her great-uncle had tried to leave and failed, but perhaps he hadn't known the whole story. Maybe the lighthouse wasn't just a prison, it was the key, a place that held a secret long forgotten, hidden beneath layers of time and salt. Evelyn forced herself to move, pushing away from the wall, her legs shaking beneath her. She didn't know where she was going, but staying in one place was a death sentence. The lighthouse wanted her to be afraid, wanted her to lose herself in the labyrinth of its twisted halls. But she wouldn't let it. Not yet. She stumbled down the hallway, her fingers brushing against the cold, slick walls. Every so often, her eyes darted to the mirrors that hung at odd angles, catching glimpses of movement in the reflection, flickers of shadows that seemed to chase her. She refused to look too closely. Seeing it again would only break what little resolve she had left. At the end of the hall, she came upon a door she hadn't noticed before. Unlike the others, this one wasn't worn with age. It was heavy, made of dark wood, and sealed with a rusted iron lock. It felt out of place, newer than the rest of the lighthouse, yet still ancient, like something that had been hidden from sight for decades, maybe longer. Her heart pounded as she reached for the handle. It was cold, unnaturally so, and her fingers recoiled at the touch, but she forced herself to turn it. The door groaned open, revealing a set of stone steps leading downward into the earth. A wave of damp, earthy air hit her face, carrying with it the faint smell of rot and decay. The voices whispered louder, as though urging her down, calling to her. He never found it. But you will? Evelyn hesitated, dread coiling in the pit of her stomach. This had to be the heart of the lighthouse, the place where the curse had been born. She knew, instinctively, that whatever waited for her down there would not be pleasant. But she had no choice. If she wanted to survive, if she wanted to escape, she had to go deeper. She had to confront whatever dark secret this place was hiding. Slowly, she descended the staircase, the damp stone slick beneath her feet. The walls seemed to close in as she moved deeper, the air growing colder and more oppressive. The flickering light from her phone barely cut through the thick shadows, and with every step, the weight of the unseen presence pressed harder against her. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a chamber even more ancient than the one she'd seen before. This room felt wrong, unnatural, as though it shouldn't exist in the physical world. The walls were covered in strange carvings, spirals, and symbols that seemed to twist and writhe when she looked at them too closely. At the center of the room stood an altar made of jagged stone, cracked and worn, yet radiating a dark energy that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. On the altar, half buried beneath a layer of dust and dirt, was a small, blackened box. Its surface was carved with the same strange symbols that covered the walls, and as she drew closer, the air around it seemed to hum with power. Evelyn's hands trembled as she reached for it, the cold emanating from the box seeping into her bones. Something deep inside her screamed to stop, to turn around and flee, but she couldn't. She had come too far. Her fingers brushed the box, and the moment she touched it, the storm outside seemed to quiet. The voices stopped, the whispers vanishing into an eerie silence that pressed against her ears like cotton. For a brief, terrifying moment, the world felt as though it had been swallowed whole. Then the box opened. Inside was a small, ancient key, blackened with age, yet humming with a malevolent energy. The moment her fingers closed around it, the silence shattered. The spirit appeared before her, its gaunt form towering over her, eyeless sockets burning with that unnatural blue glow. Its skeletal hands reached out, not with the intent to kill, but to claim. This was its domain, and she had trespassed too far. The whispers returned, louder now, a frenzy of voices all shouting over one another. Asterisk, it's yours now. You belong to the storm, to the sea. Asterisk. Evelyn stumbled back, clutching the key to her chest. She had taken something from the spirit, something it had been guarding for centuries. But she didn't understand what it was or what it meant. The figure loomed closer, its presence choking the air from the room. Evelyn felt her knees buckle as the weight of the darkness pressed down on her. The lighthouse itself seeming to pulse with the malevolent energy of the spirit. But then, from deep within the walls, she heard it, a sound like stone grinding against stone, a low, distant rumble. The altar began to shake, cracks spreading across its surface as though the very foundation of the lighthouse was unraveling. And then she realized the key wasn't just a relic. It was a lock. The lighthouse was the prison, and she had just found the way out. But there was no time to think. The spirit lunged toward her, its skeletal hands reaching out, but before it could touch her, Evelyn shoved the key into a small indentation on the side of the altar she hadn't noticed before. The moment the key turned, the room exploded with light. The spirit let out a terrible, guttural scream, its form twisting and writhing in the blinding glow. The walls trembled, the ground shook, and for a moment, Evelyn thought the entire lighthouse might collapse in on itself. But then, as quickly as it had come, the light faded. The spirit was gone, and the lighthouse stood in eerie, oppressive silence. For a long moment, Evelyn didn't move. She stood there, clutching the key, her mind spinning, her heart racing. She had done something, released something, but what? And at what cost? She could still hear the wind outside, but the storm had lessened. Yet deep within her, a part of her knew this wasn't over. The lighthouse had given up its secret, but the curse that had bound the spirit was ancient, and such things didn't end so easily. The key was only the beginning. The real terror had yet to be unlocked. The key felt heavier in Evelyn's hand as she stood there in the eerie silence of the chamber. The oppressive presence that had haunted the lighthouse for so long had momentarily dissipated, but deep down, she knew it wasn't over. The storm outside had lessened, but the wind still howled, carrying with it the echoes of a distant, unseen threat. She had unlocked something ancient, something that had been waiting far longer than she could comprehend. Slowly, Evelyn climbed the stairs, leaving the dark chamber behind. But as she ascended, the weight of the lighthouse seemed to settle on her shoulders. The carvings on the walls blurred in her peripheral vision, twisting into grotesque shapes. The air was thick with anticipation, as though the very walls were watching her, waiting for her next move. When she reached the main floor, the storm outside had returned with a vengeance. The lighthouse creaked under the force of the wind, and the windows rattled violently as rain lashed against the glass. Lightning forked across the sky, illuminating the interior in brief, blinding flashes. But it wasn't the storm that made Evelyn's skin crawl. It was the whispers. They had returned, more insistent than before. This time, they weren't faint echoes but a cacophony of voices, each one speaking over the other, desperate and urgent. Asterisk, it's not over. It's never over. Asterisk. The mirrors lining the walls reflected only darkness now, their glass cracked and smeared with a thin layer of condensation. In the reflection, she saw herself, pale and drawn, but behind her, just barely visible in the flickering lightning, was something else. A figure, shifting in the shadows, always just out of sight. The spirit hadn't left. It had been waiting. Her heart pounded in her chest as the truth dawned on her. The key hadn't freed her. It had awakened something even older, darker, and more malevolent than the spirit that had haunted the lighthouse. The air crackled with energy as the storm intensified, the wind howling through the cracks in the stone walls. The lighthouse itself groaned, as if the structure was coming to life, responding to the ancient force that now pulsed through its core. Evelyn turned, searching for an escape, but every door she passed was sealed shut, every window locked tight. There was no way out. The storm had become more than a natural occurrence. It was alive, feeding off the fear that permeated the air. Desperate, Evelyn ran to the top of the spiral staircase, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she climbed higher and higher. She didn't know what she was looking for, maybe a way to signal for help, or perhaps the light itself would offer some kind of protection. But as she neared the top, the voices grew louder, filling her mind with a frenzy of overlapping words. Asterisk, it's yours now. You've opened the door. Asterisk. Lightning flashed again, and for a brief moment, the room at the top of the lighthouse was bathed in blinding white light. The beam, meant to guide ships through treacherous waters, now felt like a beacon for something far worse. The figure stood in the center of the room, fully formed now, its gaunt, twisted body barely human. Its eyeless face turned toward her, mouth open in a silent scream that seemed to reverberate through her bones. It had been waiting for her, and now it was free. The spirit had never been the true threat. It had been the gatekeeper, bound to the lighthouse to contain something far more dangerous. And Evelyn, in her ignorance, had released it. The figure began to move toward her, its bony hands outstretched, but this time, she didn't freeze. The fear had shifted into something else, determination. She had to end this. She had to stop whatever she had unleashed, even if it meant facing it head-on. Her eyes darted to the light itself, the massive, rotating mechanism that had been guiding ships for over a century. The glass surrounding it was old, fragile, and Evelyn knew that if she could destroy it, she might have a chance. Without thinking, she grabbed a nearby wrench, her hands slick with sweat, and hurled it at the light. The metal struck the glass with a deafening crash, shattering the lens and sending shards flying in all directions. The moment the light went out, the room plunged into darkness, and the storm outside roared with renewed fury. The figure let out a guttural scream, its form writhing and twisting into shadows as if the very act of breaking the light had wounded it. But it wasn't enough. The key. The realization hit her like a bolt of lightning. She still had the key, the same one that had unlocked the altar below. It wasn't just a key to the lighthouse. It was something far more powerful, a tool that could either lock or unlock the forces that had been trapped here for centuries. With trembling hands, Evelyn pulled the key from her pocket. The spirit, now barely more than a shifting shadow, lunged toward her, but she was faster. She ran to the base of the light, where the ancient mechanism still hummed faintly. There she saw it, a small, almost invisible lock hidden beneath the machinery, as though it had been placed there long before the lighthouse had been built. The key slid in easily, as though it had been waiting for this moment. As she turned the key, the lighthouse shook violently, the walls groaning as if the entire structure was being ripped apart. The spirit let out a final, bone-chilling wail, its form disintegrating into the air, vanishing into the storm. The wind howled in fury, but this time, it felt like the storm was retreating, being pulled back into the depths of the sea. Evelyn collapsed to the floor, her breath ragged and her body trembling. The whispers were gone, the oppressive weight lifted. The storm, while still fierce, no longer felt malevolent. The lighthouse stood silent, its ancient curse finally broken. She didn't know how long she sat there, staring at the key still clutched in her hand. The terror of what had just happened was too much to process. But one thing was clear: the lighthouse had been guarding something dark, something that should have stayed hidden. And now, she had locked it away again. But as the storm outside began to subside, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly over. The key was still in her possession, and the lighthouse, though silent, seemed to hum with a quiet, waiting energy. Some doors, once opened, could never be fully closed. The lighthouse had claimed her as its keeper now, and one day, during another storm, it would call her back.